You're good to go. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. We will probably have our grand finale tonight of Michael Carruthers' Buddha. And I'm going to step back, go back one page to page 87. I think we left off on 88. But just to have a little more continuity, we'll go back to the last paragraph on 87 and we'll start there. Again, Carruthers, brief kind of recounting of Buddha's life, but especially focusing on his teachings, what was new, and the significance of that at the time. All right, bottom of 87, the teachings of merit and lay morality explain the renouncers and not merely the Buddha's success. Indeed, in ancient India, Buddhism would probably seldom have seemed markedly more successful than other movements, and taken singly, many of the Buddha's teachings to the laity could be found in other doctrines. However, the Buddha achieved a synthesis of the various elements which made the whole more than the sum of the parts. This synthesis is formed upon the Buddha's tendency to think in practical terms, on the analogy of craftsmanship, and also upon his concern with psychological explanations. So, the doctrine of skillfulness. The key to this way of thinking is embodied in a term found frequently in his discourses. The term is kusala, whose primary meaning is skillful, as a goldsmith may be skillful at making gold ornaments. It is a term which the Buddha made his own, and he used it in the first place to refer to skill in meditation. But he also used it widely to apply to skill in moral discipline and the acquisition of merit. In this application, skillful also means morally good, as we might say, he is a good man, or that was a good act. Indeed, in many contexts, skillful is the opposite of evil, and refers to the same kind of sharp distinction made in Christianity between good and evil. But for the Buddha, skillful good always had a practical, not a metaphysical or absolute flavor to it. The dead center of the term is best conveyed by a sense lost to us, but still alive among the ancient Greeks, that just as one could be skillful or good at a craft, so one could be good at being a sentient being, and hence one could be good. This term was animated by thorough reflection upon the consequences of deeds, and in particular of the attitudes, the mental actions behind deeds. For the Buddha, skillfulness cut two ways. Its consequences were good for oneself, but good for others as well. For example, the act of giving food to a monk gained one merit, and indeed with the characteristic Buddhist emphasis upon the mental side of things, this merit was conceived as being also a psychological good, a wholesome frame of mind pursuant upon liberality. But giving is also good for the monk, at the very least because the monk thereby assuages his hunger. By the same token, to cultivate moral discipline is simultaneously to avoid harm to others and to create good, skillful frames of mind in oneself. We tend to think of doing good as involving the sacrifice of one's own interests for someone else's, but for the Buddha, to do good was precisely to act both in one's own and in someone else's interest. For the monk, the stress was on one's own interest, liberation, while the means, exemplary moral discipline, incidentally achieved others' interests. But this way of thought was easily turned around to apply to laymen who, by being good to others, achieved the end of being good to themselves. This reasoning was further bolstered by the teachings that to be kind, gentle, honest, and harmless to others was in fact to invite them to behave in the same manner to oneself, do good to others, and they may do good to you. By wise reflection and moral action, Buddhists, whether monks or laymen, could achieve the fruit of their skillfulness, both here and in the next world, quote unquote. So, this actually points to the non-dual nature of Buddha's teaching. Again, in our samsaric way, our worldly way, our limited way, everything are these, distinctions: good, bad, male, female, right, wrong, far, near, all of these things. That's how the world appears to us. And we don't deny any of that. But this fact that you're doing something virtuous benefits you as well as the person that you're doing it to is right there, but practical. And that's what I think is so interesting. It's not accepting a particular philosophical position, which people can argue about and talk and think about, but it's in the actual doing. And of course, you experience the results. The Buddha's doctrine for laymen, therefore, was intimately and organically connected to his thought on his monk's training. But this connection was not limited to the level of morality alone. For the monk, the moral discipline underpins cultivation of the mind in meditation. But for both monks and laymen, the cultivation of certain mental skills and attitudes could in turn underpin morality. It is here that compassion, concern for others, enters the picture again, now as an attitude to be cultivated meditatively and as a value directed to others' welfare in general. One can transform oneself not only for liberation, but also for love. In the Buddhist texts, compassion is analyzed into three. First, compassion proper, defined as sympathy with others' suffering. Second, sympathetic joy, the enjoyment of others' good fortune. And third, loving kindness, the Buddhist sentiment par excellence. The attitude cultivated by monks and lay in loving kindness is expressed in this famous passage of very early Buddhist poetry. Whatever beings may exist, weak or strong, tall, broad, medium or short, fine material or gross, seen or unseen, those born and those pressing to be born, may they all without exception be happy in heart. Let no one deceive anyone else, nor despise anyone anywhere. May no one wish harm to another in anger or ill will. Let one's thoughts of boundless loving kindness pervade the whole world, above, below, across, without obstruction, without hatred, without enmity. Unquote. This passage compresses the attitudes underlying the morality taught by the Buddha into a single sentiment, capturing the positive spirit that is to accompany the negative injunctions. Indeed, loving kindness is absolutely necessary both in the monk's training and in the lay morality, since for Buddhists it is the mental action, the intention or attitude which counts, and not the deed itself. I should say not primarily the deed itself. The sentiment of loving kindness is certainly impersonal, and in this the Olympian detachment of the renouncer shows through. One must treat all equally, regardless of position or relationship. Indeed, in this universal sentiment, the Buddha's moral reasoning has a place. For in prescriptions for loving kindness, the meditator is to, quote, identify oneself with all, unquote. That is, just as I am subject to pain and pleasure, so are others. And just as I wish myself well, so I should wish well to others. Throughout the Buddhist world, loving kindness, supplemented by compassion for suffering, was to become the model for social sentiments beyond the family and a value in its own right. In later Buddhist folklore and thought, these sentiments grew so prominent as to overshadow even the premier value of liberation. So this is interesting too, because, like in our prayers of the four immeasurables, it's really something radical when you understand the origin of these teachings. In other words, the Buddha's first two teachers who practiced these 8 stages of meditation leading to the peak of meditational accomplishment, worldly accomplishment. A master of the renouncers of his time, it was all apart from the world. You'd be off and hopefully attaining to these high states, but that was kind of it. Now, the Buddha, though, like in our morning prayers, suddenly these, esoteric and kind of very refined, philosophical statements or meditational states as they're described are expressed as love, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity in the sense of vast impartiality. So he brought them right down to earth. And instead of something being distant and away, and there's some master sitting off in a cave apart from everyone, and you just go there and maybe try to get blessings or something by being in his or her presence. Instead, you had this active involvement in an ordinary life by practicing these four immeasurables in a way that people could understand and it was not apart from. Also interesting in this, he's very much talking about the old Pali texts and, the self-liberation teachings, especially as was later characterized, Buddha's first turning of the wheel. All these teachings are from that. The teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the conditioned codependence, interdependence, and all the various teachings that come from the self-liberation path. But it's interesting here that this scholar has realized that loving kindness and compassion were kind of like there at the instigation of this famous triad of, ethics, morality, wisdom. All Buddhist sects teach that triad. You can't have wisdom without meditation, but you can't have meditation effectively without the underlying ethics. If your life is always being stirred up by all sorts of scandals and one thing or another, and just all of this, the mind's too agitated. You have to have a calmer mind to practice meditation and certainly to accomplish. But then the wisdom is the result of that. So it becomes very simple teachings and practical too, because you can show someone that those things are just like inherently true, and you can experience that, of course, yourself. Additionally, this quote of the Buddha, you think how other people want to be treated kindly, so therefore I want to be treated kindly, so therefore I should treat other people kindly. This kind of, great harmony. You can see how meditation then has even an inner understanding, more fundamental, you might say. When you see the activities of your own mind, you suddenly come to have confidence other people are having the same kind of distractions, the same kind of malarkey going on. And that, of course, is a deeper kind of, rather than just saying I should be nice to people because I want them to be nice to me, this is more fundamental. You're seeing that we're sharing this mind. All right, we're on page 90, the discourse to the Kalamas. I don't know where the syllable is on that, but the Kalamas. The assembled structure of the Buddha's teaching to laymen is revealed in the discourse to the Kalamans, a people on the northern fringe of the Gangetic civilization. That's the civilizations that were around in the Ganges river. In that discourse, the Buddha is represented as touring with a body of monks through the area. A group of Kalamans learns of his presence and goes to him in the village of Keshaputta with a problem. Various wandering ascetics and Brahmins have traveled through, expounding and recommending their own views to the Kalamans, while attacking and rebutting the views of others. The Kalamans are confused and seek advice from the Buddha. Whom should they believe? To this confusion, the Buddha replies with a teaching which has frequently been quoted to demonstrate the Buddha's lack of dogmatism and advocacy of individual judgment. He asserts that the Kalamans should not rely on, quote, hearsay, on tradition, on legends, on learning, nor on mere inference or extrapolation or cogitation, nor on consideration and approval of some theory or other, nor because it seems fitting, nor out of respect for some ascetic, unquote. This is not a recommendation for capricious individual fancy, however, for what the Buddha recommends is his own moral reasoning from wise reflection and skillfulness, and he is confident that if the Kalamas so reason, they will each one arrive at the Buddha's moral teaching. So I think this is really important because it's true. This can be misunderstood in this way. We live in the era of the kind of this, it's hard to say, but kind of a narcissism of our modern society. This kind of wild individualism that, is justified in its own right, even though you end up with conflicts with people all over the place because there's no shared kind of understanding. So it's not just sort of a rank kind of immature individualism. But the point is that if you're just merely relying on these ways, hearsay, tradition, unthinking kind of acceptance of tradition, unthinking kind of acceptance of legends. In other words, you can do all these things so you don't have to. People do it as an escape. People do it so a defense. They don't have to look into what the source of their beliefs are. And why do they have confidence in, some theory or unlearning or some ascetic or whatever? In other words, this is his injunctions against blind faith. He's not saying don't have any faith, but rather, intelligent. So what did he say? When you know for yourself that this is unskillful and that skillful, this blameworthy and that blameless, this deprecated by the wise because it conduces to suffering and ill, and that praised because it conduces to well-being and happiness, when you know this for yourselves, Kalamans, you will reject the one and make the practice of the other. The moral teaching at which they will arrive is a straightforward one. The Kalamans will not kill, they will not take what is not given, they will not take another's wife, they will not incite others to do their own harm. These injunctions will arise naturally out of the Kalamans' experience and their reflection upon skillfulness. And this underlies it all. The incredible teachings are that with this, like even just touching the nature of your mind, and certainly to the degree that you can realize and abide in it, the virtues come out of that naturally. It's not applying a set of rules, although there are plenty of rules floating out there. Those are all just the expression of Buddha's realization. So in that sense, they're not like they appear. They're some outwardly constructed kind of structure that you have to cram yourself into. The genius of it is that it guides you, but it's from the inner experience that this naturally comes. In the first place, it is possible to infer a certain topicality in the discourse. There is reason to believe that the Kalamans, like their neighbors the Sakyans, the Buddha's own people, had an independent oligarchic republican government and had been in the remembered past a relatively autonomous people. But now they were subjected to the power of the Kosalan king, as the Sakyas were soon to be, and in their economic life, they must have felt the magnetic pull of the distant Kosalan capital. These political and economic forces were drawing the Kalamans out of a relatively simple and closed tribal society into the complex world of the civilization in the Ganges Valley, and these dislocations were compounded by new cultural forms embodied in the conflicting advice of those messengers of the Gangetic civilization, the wandering ascetics. It is impossible to believe that the injunctions against killing, lying, stealing, and so forth were wholly new to the Kalamans. Their own ancestral culture must have offered analogous injunctions. It is difficult to conceive the survival of a society which did not hold these values in some form, at least as touches the members of the society itself. However, it is characteristic of societies like the older Kalaman one that such values are not reasoned, but are rather held by virtue of tradition and custom, and dramatized in legend and ritual. Under the new conditions, these inherited moral traditions had lost their unquestioned hegemony, though, and hence, there was occasion for the Buddha to offer a new form of moral reasoning which grew out of the most basic conditions of human life. The proposed morality was not a specifically Kalaman thing, but grew out of the sheer fact of being in society at all, of having a common life, of being able to reason for one's own and others' ends, whoever was involved. This morality was meant to hold for all conditions. But of course, again, the Buddha's teaching is more than just something that works and you apply to the outside. Again, it's coming from his realization. But the Buddha envisioned more than just a new foundation for Kalaman morality, for the injunctions are meant to apply not only within Kalaman society, but to all individuals, Kalaman or not, with whom a Kalaman might deal. And the Kalamans were already implicated with many other peoples. It is typical of small-scale societies and of small groups within a larger society that their members alone are treated as full constituents of the moral community. But now the Kalamans are invited to a larger world to embrace within their moral community all living beings, and certainly all the peoples of the Gangetic Plain. The Buddha promulgated a universal morality to fit the Kalamans' enforcedly more cosmopolitan life. So again, you might remember in the beginning of this book, he was trying to imagine what these societies were like at that time and the tremendous growth and ferment that was happening, including this arising of renouncers, the ascetics, which were, not there originally in the original caste classifications. And there was apparently increase in economies and trade. And so there were all sorts of things going on among these, again, oligarchical republic kingdoms that populated or strung along the Ganges River. To this extent, the Buddha's teaching to laymen was founded on his moral reasoning. But in the discourse, this moral reasoning is in turn founded more deeply in his teachings and experience, in his analysis of the human constitution and his project for self-transformation. When he taught the monks, the Buddha emphasized that the sources of suffering, greed, hatred, and delusion, lead to one's own harm. But in this teaching to laymen, he stressed that they are generally helpful, not only harmful to oneself. So this is a quote from Buddha right now, quote, "When greed arises within a man, does it not conduce to harm? Or when hatred and delusion arise within a man, is it not when his mind is overcome with greed, hatred, and delusion that a man murders, steals, lies, and so forth? And is it not by having a mind unconquered by these things that he is able to avoid all these acts?" Unquote. In this passage, harm refers to harm caused both to oneself and to others. Just as to be skillful is to serve both one's own ends and others' ends, so to be harmful is to harm both oneself and others. The point is worth emphasizing because not only Westerners, but also later schools of Buddhism have wished to reject or improve on the Buddha's teaching on the ground that it is oblivious to others' welfare or to the existence of society. Although on balance, the Buddha was more concerned with the anatomy of individual experience than with the anatomy of society, his teaching always recognized that to be human is to be a social being. So I noticed this is a common misunderstanding, and certainly it comes from, the original, especially British Protestant missionaries who went to India as they discovered Buddha's teachings. There was a criticism that this was like navel gazing. We even hear this in our society. It's kind of selfish. You're concerned about your own. What about other people? And no one's talking about theories of government and all this kind of thing. Lama Tarchin said, for instance, that these great teachings on compassion coming out of this realization. He said, it's like when you see the interdependence and when it's experienced as a real thing. Interdependence is just a concept, just a word. But when you're living out of that, it's like your right hand will not harm your left hand. You see the oneness, or the not two-ness of it. And so there's just no way. It's just a matter of ignorance that we do all of these things. Moreover, the Buddha's view of how a layman is to mend himself so that his mind is unconquered, quote unquote, relies on more than just wise reflection. On the one hand, the Buddha presupposes in lay people a rational faculty which, if rightly directed, will produce skillful solutions to moral problems. Laymen can calculate what to do. But on the other hand, this view of laymen as having capacity for rationality is only part of the story, for the Buddha also felt that lay people could, to an extent appropriate to their station, transform themselves. Hence, in the discourse to the Kalamans, the Buddha recommends the meditation on the social sentiments, especially loving kindness. Laymen are to practice by directing loving kindness to all quarters and all beings, identifying oneself with, having a heart free of anger and hatred. The effect of this mental exercise is to establish loving kindness sooner or later as a lasting habit and motivation in action. This has two important implications. First, it means that the Buddha recommended not only why one should act skillfully, but also how the sometimes intractable human constitution can be made to do so. The Buddha was an optimist in that he thought humans capable of skillful rationality, but a realist in that he knew this rationality to requires an emotional transformation as well. One may calculate an act to be good and skillful and yet be unable to carry it out. And this common weakness was taken fully into account. Second, this practice of self-transformation is portable in the sense that in principle it may be practiced effectively by anyone. This is important because much of the human experience, and especially that beyond the bounds of an enclosed group such as the Buddhist order, cannot be manipulated to one's own ends. The Kalamans were subject to natural changes, but also and increasingly to social changes, which were beyond anyone's power to control or even to understand fully. But here at least was a matter which one could effectively handle, one's own habits and motivations. If one cannot change the world, one can at least change oneself. True, a practice for laymen such as the meditation on loving kindness might be partly dependent for its effectiveness on one's being part of a Buddhist community which cleaves to such values, but the final effort is one's own, and the focus of effort is oneself. A Kalaman traveling to the Kosalan capital or a Kalaman working his ancestral fields could both equally well practice loving kindness and compassion. So you can see Michael Carithers, kind of this modern, almost academic kind of attitude that he has. So he's come across these teachings really good. And I think I do get the sense from here that he's done some of the four mindfulness meditations, all wonderful. And so he's thinking it out, and that's wonderful. And I sometimes think this is 1983 written. We're presented, something the Tibetan Lamas come and they present this body of teachings. And for most of it, it's kind of like originally, foreign. There's something there human that touches, of course, that's what comes through, and that's why they're able to communicate at all. But in terms of the concepts and the classifications and all that, this is all something new to us, and we often don't understand the underlying assumed assumptions, basically. And so this is very helpful because you can see him, working this out in such a, I think, a good way. All right. This has two important implications. First, it means that the Buddha recommended not only why, I did that already, sorry. The discourse to the Kalamans is perhaps quite topical, but as the Buddha phrased it in the discourse, the discourse, like many of his other teachings to laymen, is applicable to anyone in a similar plight. In this, the Buddha is strikingly modern, for today it is difficult to find a people which has not been drawn into a wider, more complex, more confusing social world, as the Kalamans were drawn into the Gangetic civilization. So he has a lot of assumptions here, about what's happening with the Kalamans, but it's okay. The Buddha addressed himself by the very generality of his discourse to the wide variety of possible fates in the experience of a complex society. And that experience of complexity is ours, at least as much as it was to the ancient Indians. On the surface, people now, as then, obey the dictates of a bewildering variety of different necessities and values, but there are some traits which they all share: the capacity for misery or happiness, the capacity to harm or benefit others. Okay. Next section is called Cultural Relativism, and I think this is the final section of the book. Indeed, this modernity corresponds to certain hard-won views of our own. The Buddha was original in his consciousness of the varieties of culture in his milieu, and he was capable of recommending in the canon, for example, that different groups adhere each to its own ancestral morality and religion. The Buddha recognized that as people's values are relative to their own history and culture, we too have come to recognize this irreducible difference of values. We call it cultural relativism, and we take this to mean that other societies are not to be judged by our own. But just as cultural relativism cannot realistically be thought to mean that people can live according to just any values or with no values, so the Buddha advocated that people adhere to ancestral standards only insofar as those standards are consistent with moral skillfulness. Similarly, the Buddha taught that human individuals are not to be seen as isolated from each other, but as conjoined to each other in a weighty and consequential relationship. This is consistent with another modern view, a growing awareness that individuals are not to be understood in isolation, but as being inextricably involved in a social context. He was amazingly before his time. There is another kind of modernity, however, which the Buddha did not have, and that is an overriding preoccupation with the political dimension of human affairs. For the most part, the Buddha's discourses define three areas of concern, which, between them, make up the human world as seen by the Buddha: an individual's concern with the events of his own mind and body, his concern with his face-to-face personal relations with others, and his concern with the welfare of all sentient beings. For these three areas, the psychic, the socially very small scale, and the universal collectivity of all beings, he was willing to lay down both the way things are and the way they should be. But these descriptions and prescriptions say little about how men do and should behave as members of political collectivities, and how political collectivities should be organized. Clearly, this relative indifference to the specifics of political affairs must have contributed to the ease with which the Buddha's teachings have been found relevant in very different political climates. It also shows you the profundity of his view, because, in a sense, there are no barriers. As you heard me say, I'm often so kind of in awe about how the Buddha's teachings went to China and made such contributions, culturally to the Chinese realm, but at the same time, the Indians. I mean, again, the difference in expression, sort of cultural differences between the two are vast. And yet somehow the teachings of the Buddha, penetrated. But this is not to say that Buddha's teaching is devoid of political interest or political implications. Insofar as we can infer the Buddha's own preferences, they were for the sort of oligarchic, egalitarian, or republican political organization that seems to have held among his own people. And we know this because his prescriptions for the organization of the Sangha, the Buddhist order, which appear in a long biographical text on his last days, are set beside very similar prescriptions for another such people. The order, the Sangha, or the people, are to conduct their business in concord. Their decisions are to be unanimous. They are to respect and defer to elders, but where elders' views conflict with the teaching and disciplinary code, or the tradition of the group, one is to follow the teaching. Had such oligarchies prospered and expanded, we might have had ancient Indian theories of democracy and citizenship, such as ancient Greece gave us. But oligarchies had probably never been the principal form of government in India. They were very much on their way out when the Buddha lived, and very soon they were gone forever. Most of the Buddha's experience was with kingdoms, and no king wishes to hear radical political thought. But again, in this way, is this amazing how far in advance? It's a very remarkable kind of historical time. So the Buddha was left to talk about kings if he was to talk about politics at all. There are left to us a number of fascinating discourses which must have taken their complex literary form after the Buddha's death, but some of which quite possibly represent the Buddha's views. And in these he expands on kingship. The chief message is that kings, no less than anyone else, are subject to the moral order, to considerations of what is morally and socially skillful. When there came to be Buddha's kings, these discourses were taken at face value to construct a specifically Buddhist theory of ethical kingship. Other messages include what seems to be a recommendation for state capitalism, to the effect that the king should finance enterprises in order to bring prosperity to the people, and a contract theory of monarchy to the effect that the king is elected because he is the handsomest and best and able to keep people in line. But these messages are set in highly ironical and even humorous frames, in which the Buddha tells a fanciful story to an imaginary figure. This imaginary figure is Sharp-Tooth the Brahmin. And the consequence is the Buddha is distanced very far from the messages he seems to convey. Part of this distancing is that of a worldly renouncer looking down from the perspectives of liberation upon the folly and pettiness of even grand state affairs. But there is a keen edge to this commentary, which implies that the Buddha must have been a very perspicacious observer of the political scene. In the light of our deeply disillusioning experience of the teachings of the past, as they have been applied to the world, we might very well doubt that any past master still bears cogency and relevance. And one might further object, in the case of the Buddha, that his mastery is not worldwide, but is grounded upon views of the cosmos, such as transmigration, he means rebirth, which can never be accepted by the West. Well, don't be too sure. But I have tried to show that the philosophy of the Buddha was concerned with matters that do make his mastery available to everyone, that do bring him within Western history, though the West must, quite appropriately, expand its view of its own history beyond parochial preoccupations to embrace him. So this is kind of like the academics, what's the name? Can't remember, but it is like a message that he's giving us at the end. The Buddha was concerned with the physical and psychological basis upon which human self-transformation is possible. Such a mastery could not be lost to us. His teaching was suited to a world of different political philosophies and different religions, but a world in which certain basic values must guide personal relations if we are able to live together at all, and it is difficult to see how that mastery could be irrelevant to us. The story of the Buddha's death is recounted in a long text which, shorn of its mythical elements, portrays the last journey of an old man. Accompanied by his now continual companion, the loving but, as the text portrays him, rather bumbling Ananda, the Buddha makes his way northward over hundreds of miles, plagued by illness. Finally, the Buddha was struck down by food poisoning and came to rest in the obscure village of Kushinara. When Ananda realized that the Buddha was about to die, he went into a house and leaned against the doorframe weeping. The Buddha called Ananda to himself and told him, quote, "Do not mourn, do not weep. Haven't I told you that we are separated, parted, cut off from everything dear and beloved? You have served me long with hope, love, helpfully, gladly, sincerely, and without reserve, in body, word, and thought. You have done well by yourself, Ananda. Keep trying, and you will soon be liberated. Yeah. Nanda of the 10 great disciples, his 10 closest great disciples, Nanda was the one who did not come to enlightenment in Buddha's lifetime, but did afterwards. It was his cousin and his attendant for a long, long time. I think it was the Buddha's, when he went back after some time, when he went back to visit his father and his relations, and his wife in Kapilavastu, and it was thereafter that he left again. He was going to Rajgir, where, as you know, he gave the Perfection of Wisdom's sutras and the Amitabha Sutra, others. But at any rate, this first trip to Rajgir, he stopped at the same little village where he had first stopped when he did the Great Renunciation and left, walked through the jungles, came to this settlement some distance away from Kapilavastu. And it was while he was there that his visit to home to Kapilavastu had created such a movement that there were all these young men who decided they were going to be monks, bhikshus. And they all came to this village and took refuge with him. I think Ananda was one of those. There's also kind of delightful interactions between some of these young men who didn't leave. And they were kind of left behind, and they were a little bit shamed, for not having. It kind of strikes me like when you see these stories of like World War I breaking out, and these men that were volunteering, that kind of social kind of enthusiasm that takes over. It sounded like it was like that in the Buddha's time, but there were some who didn't join up, so to speak. So I came across a passage where the most distinguished young men of Kapilavastu had decided to renounce the world in imitation of him and follow him back to Rajgir. Two brothers, Mahanama and Anuruddha, were left behind. Anuruddha, who most agreed had never done a day's work in his life, had 3 residences for each of the seasons, one for the cold season, one for the hot season, and another for the rainy season. During the rains, he was waited on by women performing music, and he never came down for the upper story of his residence during that time. His brother, Mahanama, felt troubled by the fact that he and his brother were the only 2 who did not follow the other elite young men to imitate the Buddha and become renouncers. Their family was the only family that had no one who left the householder life for the homeless state. He then thought, since all the others have done so, let one of us renounce the world. So he wasn't going to do it himself. He's going to try to talk his brother into it. He then went over to his brother and told him his thoughts and said, so either you go or I will do so. Anuruddha said, I am far too delicate, too sensitive. It's just impossible that I should go from a life of a householder into a homeless light. You do it. Come on, dear Anuruddha, replied his brother. You don't really know the first thing about being a householder. Let me tell you what it's really like. First, you have to get your fields plowed. When that's done, you have to seed them. When that's done, you have to irrigate them, then weed them, and then get the crops harvested. Then you have to get transportation for the crops, arrange them in bundles, separate the straw, and winnow the chaff. And when that is accomplished, you have to start all over again the next year, and the same thing all over again the year after that. The work is never done. One never sees the end of labor. Death itself does not put an end to work. Then his brother replied, then you take over the duties, and I will go forth from the household into the life of the renouncer. And he left to get permission from his mother. He tried 3 times to get her consent, but she resisted each time. Then she thought of a solution that would save her son from leaving home. She was certain that kings and princes would never renounce the world. So she told Anuruddha that if he could get his royal friend Bhadia to announce with him, she would consent. Anuruddha was delighted and quickly went over to Bhadya's palace and said, "My renunciation of the world, my dear friend, is being obstructed by you. If you consent to go with me, I have my mother's consent." This is so completely down to earth to me. Here you have a talk with your brother and who's going to go and all of this, and at the same time you got to get mom's permission. It shows you kind of the obligations in Indian society. And then she does this thing, well, you got to find somebody royal who will agree with this. So he goes to talk to Bhadya. "No problem," said Bhadya. "Let that obstruction be removed. On second thought, why don't you renounce the world as you wish? I just can't give up the householder life. Ask me anything else and I'll do it, but not this." Anuruddha went through the whole argument once again, and Bhadya said, "Fine, wait for 7 years and we'll do it together." They began to haggle. 6, 5, 1, 7 months. At last the royal friend said, "Wait for 7 days, my friend, while I hand over the kingdom to my sons and brothers." "7 days is not very long. I will wait," came the reply. And so Bhadya, Anuruddha, Ananda, there he is, Bhagu, Kimbula, and Devadatta, old friends who had always played together with Upali the barber, headed out of town to catch up with the Buddha. After going some distance and passing into another territory, they took off their ornaments and tied them up in their robes. Then they turned to Upali, that's the barber, and said, "Turn back home and take these with you. They are yours." As he headed back home, it suddenly dawned on Upali that the Sakyans of Kapilavastu might be very angry when they saw him, thinking, "This is the one who persuaded the elite young men of our town to become ascetics." Why, they might even kill him. But then he thought, if these young men are on the way to becoming renouncers, why shouldn't I? Upali put his bundles in a tree, saying, "Let whoever finds this take it as a gift. It's yours." When the Sakyan youth saw Upali headed towards them, they all said, "Why have you come back for, Upali?" He told them of his decision and what had been done with the bundles of ornaments. They all agreed that he was right. The Shakyans were indeed fierce people and took Upali with them to find the Enlightened One and become ordained in the town of Unupiya. They all arrived at Rajgir just in time for the rainy season. Don't you get the sense of, first, they're a warrior people, and you can sort of sense this with the Tibetans too, way back when. I mean, they conquered Central Asia. They conquered the capital of China. And, different stories, probably all these things are true, but certainly the Emperor of China gave his Buddhist daughter to King Trisen Detsen. And it said that's how Buddhism came to Tibet. Probably wasn't quite that simple. But nonetheless, why was he giving his daughter to a Tibetan king? It's because the Tibetans were dominant. This kind of spirit of this kind of, powerful, immediate action, but moral action, protecting the community that you see in a warrior. And of course, in India, this was a caste. I mean, this was like huge and deep, tremendous tradition and obligations and belief. I mean, this went back, where are we, 500 years before Christ? I don't know when the Aryans conquered, but it may have been 3,000 years before Christ, something like that. So what I love about these texts, though, is that, you get the flavor of something that just seems so real, the practicality on the ground of these people, even kind of the flights of, inspiration of young, not thinking so much about the practicalities, but going right into this, inspired by the Buddha. Anyway, quite remarkable. Okay, any questions, anything this evening? I think Cruther's book is helpful because it's so modern, and it's even richer when you have, like we do, this experience with the traditional promulgation of the teachings, and the teachings and practices, this kind of unity, the oneness of the Buddha Dharma. So to see someone as an academic coming at this, I thought was kind of helpful. You can hear different words that come out of that same kind of appreciation. All right, anything from anybody? Yeah. So we've been thinking about what to do next for a study group, and we're going to do the Dalai Lama's introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So this is the text, and if people, it's the first complete translation of the entire Book of the Dead. So it's a wonderful book, but if I haven't checked it out to see even if any are available, but if not, we'll be able to provide anybody who wants. So let us know this week. We're just going to be reading the Dalai Lama's introductory commentary, which is quite pithy, but is 29 pages. So we can make photocopies of that for anyone who needs. And for the Zoomers, maybe we can even post it somewhere. Is there a way we can do that? Yeah, scan them and put them on. Yeah, yeah. So at any rate, the book is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Penguin Classics, His Holiness, with introductory commentary by His Holiness Dalai Lama. The let's see what else I might have to identify it. Yeah, first complete translation. Translation is by Gyurme Dorje, and Gyurme Dorje is Matthew Kapstein. He was a scholar at Columbia. He's now retired. Edited by Graham Coleman with Thupten Jinpa. Thupten Jinpa was the Dalai Lama's main translator and interpreter. But the introductory commentary by His Holiness Dalai Lama, and just again, Tibetan Book of the Dead, first complete translation. That will get you in the right way. But again, let me see. Published when? I'm looking.
It's available on Amazon, Kindle. You get a hardback, hardcover, or paperback.
Okay.
It's available.
Yeah, copyright, translation copyright, the Orient Foundation in the UK, and Gyurme Dorje, 2005. So that'll help you identify it. Graham Coleman, Thupten Jinpa, Gyurme Dorje, 2005, and also Dalai Lama's introductory comment, 2005. So there you go, Penguin, 2005. Yeah, Gyurme Dorje, Matthew Kapstein, brilliant guy. And I found myself once in the back of a pickup truck with him going to this first retreat I went to with Lama Tarchin, Napa Valley. Yeah, 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 yeah. He didn't stay for the whole retreat. I think he wanted to meet Lama Tarchin, and yeah, we didn't know how lucky we were. But his main work was on the Nyingma, and who knows why, but he wanted to meet Lama Tarchin. And I really had some wonderful talks with him in the back of this, because again, Napa Valley, with all these curvy roads going around, this very slow kind of drive from, where did we get picked up from? I can't even remember.
What a glorious experience, bro.
Yeah, yeah,
Seriously, wow.
no,
Now anyone jumps in the back of a pickup truck here, unless you're, a certain level of society, but you just get arrested immediately.
yeah, right, right. Oh, yeah, right, I wasn't jumping in random pickup trucks driving by.
It's amazing.
No, I feel,
Imagine riding in the back of a pickup truck with our kids, though.
right. No, I feel very fortunate. He's also the translator of Dudjom Rinpoche's The History of the Nyingma Lineage, that huge 1,000-page thing that I sometimes quote from. And really wonderful talks with him, because he had a lot of experience with Tibetans and Westerners especially, because it's this wonderful example of some of these, sort of pioneering. The Tibetans are so, it's just so vast, they have such hearts, and everybody's there. And they certainly didn't have, some lamas do, but generally, you're in a different culture, and not necessarily knowing the practical tools of that culture when it comes to organizing and that. So he had a lot of funny stories, because here he is, this brilliant guy and brilliantly educated, and yet, you know, the kind of funny things that can happen at Dharma centers. So anyway, I loved it. I loved it. And I only just recently discovered that he had done this, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I didn't know that. So at any rate, let us know if we'll make copies of the introductory comments if you don't purchase the entire book, which is completely understandable. And we'll go through this together. Okay? Any questions? Yeah, Steffi? Go ahead. Yes. It's from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but not from this particular translation. It's from Francesca Fremantle's translation of part of the Book of the Dead, which also we might use that at the same time because it has a wonderful introduction by Chogyam Trungpa, which I found very valuable because it is such a completely psychological explanation of some of the symbolism of the Bardo. So it's very helpful because, you know, people could see, oh my goodness, you know, again, to start to understand the meaning of these symbols is so helpful. And generally we don't, you know, you just see the picture of the deity and there it is, and no one usually goes, often don't have resources. Of course, we're fortunate that we know where to go, but even for myself, you know, it's finding the right books. You know, you have Garam Rinpoche give teachings and you're sitting there and that's wonderful, but then of course he leaves and you forget. there's no book. But with time you discover the books and use them as a reference. So yeah, those Bardo prayers are totally wonderful. And they're from the Book of the Dead. But there's many, many more. I'll try to find them in here too. Okay. Okay. So let's do a dedication. May all sentient beings, children of Buddha nature, realize the ultimate nature of mind, insight and compassion in blissful union. And may we too come to this realization and never stop from the work of great compassion. Svaha. Okay.
Hey Frank,
Yes.
I've been like going to this weird Bible study because the Bible's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
How do you tell people? I don't know. I'm just trying to learn from the pastor there because it's interesting because I don't understand the Bible at all really.
Uh-huh.